I never in my life thought that my life would become one of those movie stories. It was just one of those regular days at college when I came back to the apartment I shared with my roommate, Lily. Or so I had thought. What greeted me wasn't the sound of her laughter or the sweet smell of vanilla candles wafting from her bedroom. Instead, the apartment was silent, eerily so. At first, I shrugged it off, figured maybe she went to the library or out with friends. But as hours turned into a sleepless night, that panic began to seep in. Her phone was left on the kitchen counter, her favorite jacket still hanging by the door. Lily never went anywhere without those. The next morning, I called everyone I could think of, her boyfriend, classmates, even her parents. Nobody had heard from her. The police were sympathetic but not too worried. After all, adults have the right to disappear if they want to. But this wasn't like Lily. She was the responsible one, the planner, the person who'd leave a sticky note on the fridge if she went out for more than an hour. Days passed, and the apartment grew suffocating. It wasn't just the silence. It was the growing sense that something was off, the feeling that even the walls held secrets. That's when I started to notice the little things. It began with a sticky note on her desk, one I'd have sworn I hadn't overlooked in my initial panic. In her familiar scrawl, it read, "If anything happens to me, look in the vents." My stomach turned. What could that mean? I tried to convince myself it was a joke, some kind of prank, but curiosity got the better of me. Flashlight in hand, I unscrewed the vent cover in her room, my hands shaking. Inside, I found a small notebook, its pages filled with cryptic notes, sketches, and what looked like codes. There were maps of the apartment, markings on certain spots, her desk, the closet, even the bathroom mirror. One entry stood out. "He's watching me. I don't know who to trust." Who was he? I immediately thought about the maintenance guy who always lingered a little too long, or the neighbor across the hall who never made eye contact. Paranoia wrapped its icy fingers around me, and all of a sudden, everyone seemed suspect. Determined to understand what had happened, I followed the clues in Lily's notebook. One marking led me to her closet, where I found a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a burner phone with one unread message. "Did you tell her yet?" Hey? Did that mean me? I replayed every interaction we'd had over the past few weeks, searching for signs I'd missed. Had Lily been trying to warn me? Protect me? Or had she been involved in something she couldn't escape? The more I had unraveled, the less and less I knew my best friend. Receipts of cash withdrawals that were far beyond her reasonable reach. A photo of some man I didn't recognize, and a key to another door. Strange things began to happen around the apartment. Lights flickered unpredictably, my belongings were moved, and I heard faint whispers at night. First, I thought it was stress or sleep deprivation, but then I found another note, one that wasn't in Lily's handwriting. It simply read, "Stop looking." Fear rooted me to the spot. Someone had been in the apartment, someone who knew what I was doing. I wanted to run, to leave it all behind, but I couldn't abandon Lily, not when I was this close to understanding. Instead, I changed the locks, kept the burner phone on me everywhere, and slept with a knife under my pillow. The key led me across town to a storage unit. Inside, I found one thing: a video camera. The footage was grainy and disjointed, but it showed Lily in our apartment, speaking to someone just out of frame. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "She doesn't know anything. Leave her out of it." My blood ran cold. Whoever she was talking to wasn't visible, but their shadow stretched across the wall like a looming threat. The final clip was the worst. Lily was sitting on her bed, crying. "If you're watching this," she said, staring directly into the camera, "I'm sorry. I tried to fix it, but he won't let me." The police took the footage and promised to investigate, but I knew better than to rely on them. This was bigger than a simple disappearance. Lily had been trapped in something far beyond my understanding, and now I was too. The whispers grew louder at night, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't always move when I did. The feeling of being watched was no longer a sensation, it was a certainty. One night, I woke to find another note, my nightstand. "You're next." I packed a bag that night, ready to disappear. But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw him, a man in a dark coat, his face hidden in shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, blocking my only exit. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about Lily. It was about control, fear, and the things that thrive in the shadows of our lives. I don't know if I will ever find Lily or if I will share her fate. But as I write this, locked in a motel room miles away, I can still feel his eyes on me. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors shouldn't be opened. And some roommates should never be missed. Ready for a chill? Share your theories about what happened to Lily in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more spine-tingling stories. It all started with the Thompsons moving into their dream home, situated on a quiet cul-de-sac. The house was just about perfect. Spacious rooms, big backyard, and friendly neighbors. Wanting to protect their haven, they had invested in the latest in home security systems, one with AI-enhanced cameras, motion sensors, and instant alerts. The house will be safer than Fort Knox, Kevin joked as he fitted the final camera in the living room. For weeks, everything worked flawlessly. Alerts would ping in occasionally, a stray cat crossing the lawn, a delivery driver dropping off packages, but nothing unusual. The system gave them peace of mind, especially when they were away. Until it didn't. The first strange alert came on a Saturday afternoon. The Thompsons were at the mall when Kevin's phone buzzed. Motion detected in the living room. Probably a glitch, Kevin muttered, brushing it off. He opened the app and reviewed the live feed. The living room looked just the way they had left it, silent, still, and empty. "See, nothing," he reassured his wife, Emily. She nodded, but couldn't shake the unease creeping into her chest. Over the next few days, these alerts became more frequent. Every time Kevin checked, nothing was out of the ordinary in the footage. Probably just the system adjusting, he told himself, but Emily wasn't so sure. At 2:13 one morning, an alert came through. Half asleep, Kevin ignored it, assuming it to be another false alarm. But the morning after, curiosity got to him. As he scrolled through the recorded clips, his heart stopped. There it was, barely noticeable at first, a faint shadow moving across the living room floor. It wasn't the flicker of headlights or the play of curtains. It was deliberate, human-like. "Emily, you need to see this," he called out, his voice trembling. They rewound the tape, enlarged it, slow-played it. A dark figure, tall and featureless, glided silently across the room and vanished into the hallway. "But the doors were locked," Emily whispered. "The alarm didn't go off." Kevin had no answer. Over the week that followed, the activity ramped up. Alerts became almost nightly for the Thompsons. Reviewing the footage was a grim ritual, revealing more shadowy figures, sometimes one, sometimes several, drifting through their home like intruders of another world. Every clip raised more questions. Why didn't the alarm go off? How were these figures getting in? And why wasn't the camera capturing them leaving? Other strange occurrences began to happen. Lights would flicker, doors were slightly ajar, and cold spots appeared in rooms. She tried to explain it away, but the explanations felt hollow. Their two kids, Mia and Ethan, began complaining of nightmares. Mia, the youngest, spoke of people watching her from the corners of her room. Ethan, older and braver, dismissed it at first, until he saw the shadows too. One night, Ethan burst into their bedroom, pale and shaking. "There was someone at the foot of my bed," he stammered. Kevin searched the house from top to bottom, baseball bat at his side, and found no trace of an intruder. Then when he consulted the footage, there it was indeed, a figure in Ethan's room, standing by his bed before disappearing. The family's once cozy home had turned into a prison of paranoia. Emily insisted they call the security company. A technician came out, ran diagnostics, and found nothing unusual. "The systems was working perfectly," he assured them. "Then what's causing this?" Emily demanded, showing him the clips. The technician's face paled. "That's not possible," he murmured, stepping back as if the screen might infect him. Desperate for answers, they called in a paranormal investigator. The gray-haired, grave man walked through the house, his face solemn. "This place has energy," he said finally. "Whatever's here, it's not just passing through. It's tied to you now." Kevin refused to believe it. "This is just some tech malfunction," he insisted, his voice rising. But Emily wasn't so sure anymore. The words of the investigator echoed in her mind. "It's tied to you now." What had they done to invite this? The tension between them grew. Kevin spent hours researching security systems, determined to prove it was a technical issue. Emily, on the other hand, delved into the history of their home, searching for clues. She found nothing. The breaking point came one stormy night. The family huddled together in the living room, too afraid to sleep in separate rooms. Kevin had set up his laptop to monitor the live feed. Around 3 a.m., the alerts started again. Movement in the kitchen, then the hallway, then the living room itself. The shadows didn't just drift this time, they loomed. Darker, more defined. And then the feed went black. The lights flickered out. The house was plunged into darkness. Emily screamed. The kids clung to her, crying. In the pitch-black silence, Kevin heard it, a low, guttural whisper, close enough to make the hair on the back of his neck stand up. When the power clicked back on, they didn't wait to pack. The Thompsons fled, leaving behind their dream home and everything in it. They never went back. The house remains vacant to this day, the security system still online. Occasionally, Kevin checks the app, morbidly curious. The alerts haven't stopped. It seemed innocent enough at first sight, a quaint reminder of childhood friendships that begin with handwritten letters. I remember holding the first envelope in my hands, addressed in neat block letters to my son Nathan. The return address simply read, "Your friend Peter," a name I had never heard from Nathan before. My son, being only 6, was still learning to write his own name, let alone correspond by mail. I chalked it up to a neighborhood child prank or a curious embrace. It's what parents do when the world doesn't make sense. We rationalize it. Only this was something I couldn't explain away. Nathan hadn't been his usual talkative self since we'd moved into this old Victorian house, where I was consumed with its charm, from its intricate moldings to its stained glass windows and that cozy creak in its floorboards. Nathan hadn't taken easily to this change. He'd sit for hours in his room talking to someone or something I couldn't see or hear. "Who are you playing with, sweetie?" I'd ask. "Peter," he'd say with a shrug, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The name didn't faze me at first. Lots of kids have imaginary friends. It wasn't until the letters started arriving regularly, almost predictably, that I began to feel the first tremors of alarm. Each letter started out innocently enough. Peter would describe games he and Nathan had played in the yard, conversations I had overheard through the crack of Nathan's bedroom door. But as months went by, the tenor changed. "Nathan doesn't remember, but we've played before. I showed him the hiding place. He'll know soon." Or worse, "Why did you take my place? He's my friend, not yours." The handwriting stayed eerily consistent, neat and devoid of the shakiness one might expect from a child. My husband, ever the rational one, suggested that Nathan was behind it. But deep down, I knew better. My son couldn't craft such intricate sentences, let alone hide letters where only I would find them, in the mailbox, tucked between the folds of laundry, even once beneath my pillow. I searched out of desperation. The previous owners had been cagey, selling in a hurry and then disappearing. It had taken a few hours at the town library to discover part of their story. The house had once had a young boy in it, a boy named Peter, who repeatedly appeared in local newspaper files, almost always as kind and mischievous. But one article caught my attention, a piece from nearly 7 years ago, headlined, "Local Boy Missing, Search Continues for Peter Thompson." Peter had vanished in mysterious circumstances. The family moved shortly after, unable to bear the weight of their loss. No trace of Peter was ever found. That night, I confronted Nathan. "Where did you hear about Peter?" I asked, grasping his narrow shoulders hard. He frowned, confused. "He told me, Mommy. He says he's waiting to finish the game." "What game?" I pressed, my voice trembling. Nathan hesitated, as if he'd been sworn to secrecy. "Hide and seek, but he got stuck. He said I'd help him hide better this time." Something cold and ancient twisted in my gut. The letters turned darker. One morning, I found one that made my breath catch. "It's not fair. She can't keep him. She took me from my family. Now she's taking Nathan. Stop her before she hides him too." But who was she? I had no answers, only questions that seemed to spiral in my mind on a perpetual loop. As if on cue, I started hearing whispers in the house, whisper quiet and indistinct, but real. Nathan's room grew colder than the rest of the house, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. One night, I woke up to find him sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room. "Who's there, baby?" I whispered. It's Peter. He says he's scared. He wants me to go with him. I slept in Nathan's room after that, determined to protect him. The whispers continued, growing louder, until one night they became words. Help me. She's coming. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. Nathan was gone. His bed was empty, his blankets thrown off, as if he'd fled in some rush. Frantically, I searched the house, calling his name. It wasn't until I checked the basement, a place Nathan had always been too afraid to enter, that I found him. He was crouched behind an old trunk, trembling. He said, "She's here," he murmured. The next day, the final letter arrived. It was addressed to me this time. "She's angry because you didn't listen. You'll be sorry. She'll take him, like she took me." Beneath the words was scrawled a crude drawing, a stick figure of a woman looming over two children, one of whom was crossed out. I couldn't stay another night. I packed Nathan and myself into the car and drove to a motel, leaving behind everything but the clothes on our backs. My husband thought I was overreacting, but I knew the house was no longer safe. A week later, investigators searched the property. I'd reported the letters and Peter's disappearance to the police, hoping they'd believe me despite the absurdity of my claims. They uncovered something chilling. Beneath the floorboards of Nathan's room, they found the skeletal remains of a child. DNA tests confirmed it was Peter Thompson. I've never told Nathan what they found in our old home. He is too young to understand, and I don't want to burden him with knowledge of how close he came to becoming another tragedy. Sometimes I wonder if Peter ever found his peace. But on quiet nights, when the wind is howling and the shadows are alive, moving of their own accord, I almost think I hear the whisper of a child's voice. Your turn to hide. It started as a low annoyance, gentle thuds against the wall, which were barely perceivable at first. My husband Ethan and I had just moved into this rather modest apartment with creaking floorboards and paper-thin walls. The noises started on the second night. First, it sounded like someone was dragging furniture across the floor. We just brushed it off. Movers do have their building quirkiness. But as the weeks went on, the sounds grew more distinct and peculiar. At night, we'd hear muffled conversations, although no one seemed to answer back. Sometimes it was soft humming, eerily melodic yet disjointed. It wasn't loud enough to disturb us entirely, but it was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. I mentioned it to Ethan. "Have you seen who lives next door?" "No," he said, putting down his coffee. "But I've heard him, or her. Seems like a night owl." That's the thing. We never saw them. We'd pass by their door on our way out, but it was always closed. No packages, no visitors, and no sounds during the day. It was Sunday morning when I finally saw him, our elusive neighbor. I had gone out to water the plants in the communal hallway, and then I saw that his door was ajar. He came out quietly, as if he had waited for me to leave. "Good morning," I said, forcing a smile. He froze, his eyes darting toward me like a deer caught in headlights. He was tall and wiry, with pale skin that seemed untouched by sunlight. His clothes hung loosely, as though he'd lost weight recently, and his black-framed glasses magnified his sunken eyes. "Morning," he replied, his voice hoarse. He quickly locked his door and slipped past me without another word. That interaction made me uneasy. Something about him was not right. His movements too calculated, his gaze too sharp. I tried to brush it off. After all, everybody has their weirdness, don't they? But Ethan did notice how uncomfortable I seemed when relating the incident. "Probably shy," Ethan said. "Or maybe he has just had bad experiences with neighbors." Over time, the mystery of our neighbor deepened. His windows were always covered with heavy blackout curtains, even during the day. He never left his trash out like the rest of us. Instead, he would sneak down to the dumpsters late at night, carrying small, tightly sealed bags. Ethan, always the pragmatic one, dismissed my growing unease. "You're overthinking it," he said. "Not everyone wants to be buddy-buddy with their neighbors." But it wasn't his secrecy that really got to me. It was more the way he moved, like he didn't want to leave an impression of having been present. He never greeted anyone or lingered in the hallways. And those noises, those unexplainable noises, lingered on. My breaking point came when Mrs. Linden, this older woman who lived downstairs, mentioned something in passing. Strange things happen in that apartment, she said, nodding toward our neighbor's door. The last couple that lived there disappeared without a word. Didn't even bother to break their lease. The revelation sent chills down my spine. Disappeared? How? Curiosity got the better of me. That evening I scoured the internet for anything about our building. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No crime reports or complaints. It was as if the previous tenants had never existed. Ethan found my obsession quite funny at first, but even he began to feel unease when the noises escalated. One night, we heard what sounded like scratching, long, deliberate strokes against the shared wall. Ethan banged on the wall in frustration. "Can you keep it down?" he yelled. The scratching stopped immediately. The silence that followed was suffocating. Our neighbor's behavior grew increasingly erratic. One night, I caught him staring at our door from the hallway security camera. He stood there for hours, unmoving, until the sun began to rise. "That's it," Ethan said. "We're reporting this to the landlord." But when we confronted Mr. Hadley, the landlord, he seemed oddly dismissive. "Don't worry about him," he said, his tone almost patronizing. "He's harmless." Harmless? I wasn't so sure anymore. My instincts screamed otherwise. Then one evening, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. "We're getting answers tonight," he said, his jaw set with determination. He knocked on our neighbor's door. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, just enough to reveal our neighbor's face. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "We've been hearing strange noises," Ethan said. "And honestly, you've been acting unusual." Our neighbor's expression darkened. "I value my privacy," he said. "Is that so hard to understand?" Before Ethan could respond, the door slammed shut. That night, I lay in bed and couldn't sleep. Something about what our neighbor had said didn't sit right. What was he hiding? Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I decided to dig deeper. I managed to find an old newspaper article on a man who had occupied our neighbor's apartment a long time ago. He also kept to himself, a lot like our current neighbor, and many had suspected him of involvement with the disappearance of several tenants. But there was no resolution to the case. He simply vanished into thin air. Ethan and I chose to leave. It had gotten out of hand. The louder the noises were as we packed our belongings, the more frantic, almost desperate. The last night we heard it loud and clear, a faint, pleading voice. "Help me," it whispered. Ethan took up a flashlight and headed next door. I begged him not to go, but he just wouldn't listen. He pried open our neighbor's door and vanished inside. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, trembling. Then the noises ceased. Ethan never returned. The police found nothing that would lead them to any kind of foul play. Our neighbor was missing, but his apartment was stripped bare. No furniture, no belongings, just an empty shell. The next day I moved out of the building, taking with me a piece of myself I'd never get back. To this day, I have no idea what happened to Ethan. But at night, late at night, I still hear the same sounds, scratching, humming, muffled voices, behind the walls of my new apartment. I had always thought of myself as a light sleeper. I wake up with every little sound, and I never experienced anything unusual during the night. That changed after a particularly grueling week at work. Deadlines were crushing, my boss was breathing down my neck, and coffee had become my lifeline. By Friday, I was so exhausted, I didn't even bother changing out of my work clothes before collapsing into bed. The first incident happened that night. I woke up outside in my backyard. The cool grass damp against my bare feet, the air crisp, and leaves rustling in the wind. It was disorienting, as I had no memory of how I got there. Had I gone for a midnight walk and forgotten? I chalked it up to exhaustion and stress. After all, I wasn't prone to sleepwalking, but there's a first time for everything, right? Over the succeeding nights, the incidents intensified. My sleepwalking became nightly routine. I woke up in odd places, the kitchen, the living room, once in the garage. Each time, my heart pounded with the disorienting realization that I moved without knowing. One morning, I woke up with dirt under my fingernails. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been gardening, and the idea of digging in my sleep was unsettling. What was I doing out there? I began locking my doors and windows, hoping it would keep me contained. It didn't help. I'd wake up to find them mysteriously unlocked, my footsteps leading into the yard. Daytime was slowly unraveling. I could hardly get a wink, always tortured by the thought of what I might do next. I read up on sleepwalking, how in most instances it was harmless, but it just didn't seem to fit. People talked about wandering around or doing some mundane tasks. My episode seemed purposeful, like something or someone was in control. One night, I set up a camera in my bedroom. I thought if I could see myself, it would provide some answers. The footage chilled me to my core. Around 2 a.m., I sat up in bed, my movements unnaturally stiff. My eyes were open, but there was no recognition in them, just a vacant stare. What disturbed me most was how I moved. It wasn't the slow, aimless shuffling I'd expected. I walked with intent, heading directly for the door. Things took a darker turn when I woke up, standing at the edge of the highway near my home. Cars zoomed past, their headlights glaring. My pulse raced as I stumbled back onto the shoulder, horrified. How had I gotten there without waking up? The danger couldn't be ignored any longer. My nocturnal outings were not just strange, but they were life-threatening. I shared with a close friend, Mark, who advised me to see a sleep specialist. The specialist diagnosed me with parasomnia and recommended medication to suppress the episodes. For a while, it seemed to work. I slept through the nights incident-free, and the relief was immeasurable. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as I was reviewing old footage out of morbid curiosity, I noticed something strange. In the corner of one video, near the window, there was a faint shadow. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, but as I watched more footage, the shadow appeared again and again, always at the same time, just before I got out of bed. It felt like a punch to the gut, the realization that I wasn't alone. The following nights were a total terror. Even when the doors were locked, I woke up and found muddy footprints trailed from my bed down to the backyard. The shadow in the footage began to take shape and define itself more clearly. Whatever it wasn't some trick of the light. It was a person. Whatever it was, he or she was inside my house. I confronted Mark, desperate for answers. He tried to reassure me, insisting it was just my imagination fueled by sleep deprivation. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. The breaking point came on a night that seared into my memory. I woke up to find myself standing in the basement. The air was damp, and the faint hum of the boiler filled the silence. I wasn't alone. Around the edge of the room, there was a movement. There stood a figure, enveloped in darkness, its contours dimly outlined. My breath would hardly reach down into my throat as it pressed toward me. "Who are you?" I managed to bring out in a hoarse voice, trembling. He made no answer. Instead, his hand rose, pointing at me. The next thing I remember, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I looked around the room, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows. I moved out of that house the very next day. I told myself it was for my own safety, but deep down, I knew I was running. The sleepwalking stopped after I left, but the unease didn't. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I had been targeted, and whatever had invaded my life wasn't done with me. Even now, in my new apartment, I sleep with one eye open. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind sends a chill down my spine. I don't know what I've encountered, and I am not sure I want to find out. All I know is that I'll never feel safe again. We moved onto Pinewood Lane on one of those crisp, smog-free autumnal mornings, the sort of day where the sun feels warm on the skin, but there's a bite to the wind. My wife Laura was taken by the charms of the neighborhood. Neat little hedgerows, identical mailboxes, and the faint scent of newly baked bread wafting through open windows. She viewed it as the culmination of the American dream. The neighbors were friendly, almost disturbingly so. Smiles came quickly, conversations were polite but shallow, and everyone seemed to have a vested interest in our arrival. Mr. Carter from across the street offered to lend us his ladder. Mrs. Hargrove next door baked us an apple pie. It was all so picture-perfect that it made me uneasy. Laura said I'd overthought it, but I couldn't get over the fact that their gazes were hovering a little too much when they did watch us. First off, I had thought, oh, curiosity probably. We're the new people on the block, so normally people find outsiders intriguing. But as days went into weeks, The staring didn't stop. Late at night, while unpacking boxes in the living room, I'd glance out the window to see shadows shift behind curtains across the street. Once, I caught Mrs. Hargrove peering through her blinds at 2 a.m., her silhouette framed by the dim glow of a street lamp. When I waved, she didn't wave back. Instead, she disappeared into the darkness of her house. Laura thought I was paranoid, but even she started to feel the uneasiness of the watchful attention. The neighbors would know when we left for work and came back, and even when we took out the trash. It was like we were all in some unsaid schedule, being watched over and cataloged. One evening, I decided to confront the Carters. Their house, a mirror image of ours, always had at least one light on, and it was impossible to avoid the faint outline of someone watching us. With Laura's hesitant blessing, I walked across the street and knocked on their door. "Evening, Mr. Davis." Mr. Carter greeted me, his smile wide but unconvincing. Behind him, his wife stood silently, her hands clasped tightly as though she were bracing for something. "What can I do for you?" I wanted to ask if everything's okay. We've noticed people watching us. It feels like we're being, observed. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, more forced this time. "We're just a close-knit community. We like to keep an eye out for each other. Makes the neighborhood safer." I wanted to press further, but the way his wife's eyes darted nervously behind him stopped me. "Well, let us know if there's anything we can do to fit in," I said, retreating back to the safety of my own home. 2 days later, a letter came in our mailbox. It was handwritten on pristine white stationery, inviting us to a neighborhood watch meeting. The wording was friendly, but there was an insistence in the tone that felt more like an obligation than an invitation. "We should go," Laura said, trying to mask her unease. "Maybe this is their way of welcoming us properly." The meeting was held in the Hargroves' basement, a sterile, windowless room filled with mismatched chairs. Just about every adult from the neighborhood was there, faces blank but expectant. Mr. Carter stood at the head, addressing the group with the assurance of a seasoned politician. "Our community thrives because we take care of our own," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "Outsiders can disrupt the balance we have worked hard to achieve. That is why we watch, to protect." The words outsiders and protect hung in the air like a warning. Laura squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my skin. We were the outsiders. Over the following weeks, the rules of Pinewood Lane became apparent. Any deviation from the norm was met with subtle but unmistakable disapproval. When Laura put up a bird feeder in the front yard, it disappeared overnight. When I parked my car slightly off-center in the driveway, Mr. Carter, helpfully, pointed it out the next morning. The worst offense was when our son, Ethan, accidentally kicked a soccer ball onto the Hargroves' lawn. Before he could get it, Mrs. Hargrove appeared on her porch, holding the ball with an air of quiet malice. "We don't tolerate disruptions," she said, handing it back without breaking eye contact. One night, the oppressive atmosphere reached a crescendo. Ethan had been complaining of nightmares, saying he saw people outside his window at night. I had always dismissed this as childish imagination until I saw it myself. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of hushed whispers. Peering through my window blinds, I saw many of my neighbors were congregated in our front yard, their faces cloaked in darkness. They did not do anything, just standing and watching. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the group had dispersed. "No sign of trespassing," the officer said, his tone indifferent. When I insisted on filing a report, he gave me a strange look. "This is Pinewood Lane," he said. "Nothing ever happens here." Laura and I knew we couldn't stay. We packed our bags and told Ethan we were going on a vacation. But as we loaded the car, the neighbors started to assemble. One by one, they came out of their houses, their faces empty but determined. "Leaving already?" Mr. Carter called out, his voice without the ring of his usual friendliness. "You're part of this community now. You can't just leave." They closed in, forming a semicircle around our car, and panic set in. Laura screamed for them to get back, but they didn't move. Ethan started crying, and I felt the weight of their gaze upon me like a physical force. We somehow managed to drive away. But as I sped down the street, I looked back through the rearview mirror. The neighbors stood in perfect formation, their faces aglow from the flickering streetlights, watching, always watching. It has been months since we left Pinewood Lane, but the memories linger on like a bad dream. We've moved to a new city, far from the suffocating grip of that neighborhood, but I just can't get rid of this feeling that we are still being watched. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, I catch a glimpse of movement outside the window. Just a shadow, I tell myself. Just my imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. Once you're marked as an outsider, you can never truly escape. It was one of those nights when everything felt just a little too still. The kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every creak and groan in your home. I had been curled up on my couch, half watching a forgettable rom-com, half scrolling through social media, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I didn't answer at first. Late-night calls from numbers I didn't recognize were usually spams, someone calling to sell insurance or claiming I owed money to some fake collection agency. Then it rang again. I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen. Something in the persistence made me uneasy. I answered against my better judgment. Hello? There was silence on the other end except for the faintest sound of breathing. Who is this? I asked, trying not to show the slight quake in my voice. It was only then that I heard a low, slow response, almost playful in distortion. You don't remember me, do you? I hung up at once, telling myself it was some sick prank. But as I stared at my phone, dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. My hands felt clammy, my breath coming faster than it should. The logical part of my brain told me to brush it off, but something felt wrong. The next call came 10 minutes later. Stop calling me, I snapped, my voice sharper this time. Oh, come on, the voice said, a hint of mockery bleeding through the distortion. We're just getting started. I was about to hang up again when they said something that made my blood run cold. How's Coco? My hand froze, the phone still pressed to my ear. Coco was my cat, the one currently sleeping in a tight ball at the foot of the couch. I didn't respond. The voice chuckled, a sound that grated against my nerves. She's such a pretty thing. Black fur, white paws, always looks so peaceful when she sleeps. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. I glanced at the window, then at the door, locking both in quick succession. The blinds were already drawn, but I still felt exposed, like whoever was on the other end of that line could see straight through them. How do you know that? I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The voice disregarded my question. You really shouldn't keep your spare key under the flower pot, you know? It's not very original. I didn't sleep that night. I double-checked every lock in the house, moved a chair under the door handle, and sat in the corner of my bedroom with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand. The phone calls didn't stop, but I refused to answer them. Instead, I heard voicemail after voicemail. Some were just static, others were riddled with cryptic comments that sent chills racing down my spine. You left your light on in the kitchen again. Wasteful. Red really isn't your color, but you wore it anyway today, didn't you? You twitch in your sleep. Did you know that? I deleted each one, but the damage was done. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The police were sympathetic but useless. Change your number, they suggested. Be more careful about sharing personal information. As if I hadn't thought of that. When the next call came, I answered it. This time, no pleasantries left my mouth. What do you want from me? I asked, firmly this time. This time, there was a different voice at the other end of the line. No distortion, no theatrics at all. It sounded normal, familiar even. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice crackling with the weight of my fear and frustration. There was a pause. Then the voice said my name, my full name. I just wanted to see if you'd recognize me, they said, almost wistfully. My blood turned to ice. It was a voice I knew, one I hadn't heard in years. A voice from a chapter of my life I had buried deep, hoping it would stay there. Jake, I whispered, my throat tightening. You do remember, he said, a note of triumph in his tone. I wasn't sure if you'd forgotten me already. But then again, how could you? You're the reason my life fell apart. Jake? A name I hadn't spoken or thought of since college. He had been my roommate's boyfriend, a volatile, controlling presence that cast a shadow over every room he entered. I had been the one to convince her to leave him, I had driven her to the police station, helped her file a restraining order. Apparently, he hadn't forgotten. "You're insane," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he admitted, "but at least now you know how it feels to have someone invade your life, to have someone rip everything away from you." I hung up and called the police again, this time with a name. They promised to look into it, but their assurances did little to calm my nerves. That night, I slept over at a friend's place, too afraid to be alone. The next morning, I headed back home, my heart heavy. The door was ajar. Inside, all was as it had been, except for one thing. On my dining table, a single item, a photograph of me, taken through my bedroom window. On the back, a message scrawled in shaky handwriting, "See you soon."
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.